Has it really been 3 years since I switched to Linux as my daily driver? So, February 25th of 2019 was the day that I switched from Windows to Linux as my daily driver. And that was a little over 3 years ago at the time of recording this video. And I just wanted to take a look back on how I got here and why I'm glad I made the switch. So as you may know, the Linux distribution that I'm on currently is Ubuntu, and I've been with it since my very first day on Linux, February 25th of 2019, right up to the present day. And I can say with confidence that Ubuntu is a distribution that is very welcoming to beginners. I mean, it's pretty easy to install, pretty easy to find your way around, but that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to look back on how I landed here. And to fully understand how I landed on Ubuntu specifically, I actually need to go all the way back to around 2015, which is kind of hard to believe was 7 years ago already. But that was the year that I had first heard of Ubuntu. Now, at that point, I didn't know that Ubuntu was a distribution of Linux, and I'd never even heard of Linux, so I thought there was just Windows or Mac for computer operating systems, and that's it, like most people. But I do remember that someone gave my brother a copy of Ubuntu on a flash drive. I can vaguely remember the old Ubuntu boot up screen with its purple background and the old Unity desktop. Now I can't remember what release it was, but I think it was 14.04 LTS. I remember I kind of played around with it for literally 2 minutes. And I also do remember that this is the operating system that my brother used to teach me a little bit of the very basics of HTML, which was actually the first programming language that I ever touched in my life. Although that didn't give me much prior experience with Ubuntu, and the memories of that are very vague. That was my first time ever touching a Linux distribution in my life. Now fast forward to April 2017, when I finally got my first computer, and I mean one that I actually have to myself. Like before then I actually just shared a computer with my brother, but April 2017 was my first computer that I actually had to myself. I remember it was a 2010 Samsung R580, and by the way, the computer I have now is a 2017 Lenovo IdeaPad 32015 ABR. That's a mouthful, I know, but anyway, it was a hand-me-down from my mom because she had actually replaced that computer because the original hard drive in it crashed, but my brother actually replaced the old hard drive with a new one in order to get it operational again, and he and my mom thought that this might be a nice gift for me. And this actually is my first time experiencing the true freedom that comes with having my own computer to myself. Like first time having administrator privileges, which allowed me to explore the operating system to the full, at least within the confines of what Windows offers. I remember having Windows 8 on it, which, believe it or not, I actually did like the look and feel of Windows 8. I mean, if I revisited it now, I probably wouldn't really care for it. But anyway, well, I have gained a bit of knowledge about computers using my brother's computer and my iPad, which at one point was actually my family's iPad, but having my own computer actually allowed me to delve a lot deeper. But anyway, now let's fast forward to a year later in April 2018, when I actually upgraded to Windows 10 using my brother's Windows 10 install DVD that he made originally for backup purposes, but it actually ended up upgrading me for free. What I didn't realize at the time is that although Microsoft had officially ended the offer to upgrade from Windows 8 to Windows 10 for free 2 years before, back in 2016, unofficially, the free upgrade still works. And I believe it will continue to work all the way up until Windows 10 drops out of support in 2025. Now, I remember when I first upgraded to Windows 10, I thought, wow, this is cool. But as I began to use it more and more, there were just a few things that kind of picked at me and nagged at me that I just absolutely hated. And it's actually very interesting how this became obvious to me and made me realize that I actually wanted off the Windows platform. So in August 2018, the right hinge on my laptop broke, which rendered it unable to close, which that meant that although it was still working at that point, it was no longer reliable, meaning that the screen could fall off at any time. Now, I do have a working hinge right now on this computer. Like I mentioned, this is my second one. But it actually took me until May 2019, so 9 months before I could finally afford to replace that thing. Within that time, I actually got curious as to what the Mac platform looked like. And actually, fun fact, Ubuntu actually wasn't the first operating system I was looking to switch to. The very first one was Mac OS. But looking at Mac OS actually made apparent to me the security and privacy issues with Windows, which made me really want off the platform even more. Problem was, neither me nor my parents could afford to buy a Mac, and Chromebooks just didn't seem like a viable option to me. When I realized that Macs were simply too expensive, I actually thought, is it possible to run Mac OS on a Windows PC? And it turns out there was this whole online community around building Hackintoshes, which are exactly what I just said, Windows PCs that run Mac OS. But unfortunately, it turned out that for my particular scenario, since I was more after pre-built laptops than self-built full-size towers, and you can't exactly build your own laptop, unfortunately, combined with other caveats like it would be liable to be borked by a future macOS update, which, especially for security reasons, was kind of a deal breaker for me. It didn't take very long for me to realize that the Hackintosh route was really not a practical option for me. But I do remember watching an old YouTube video uploaded by TechQuickie back in 2017 around how to build a Hackintosh. And I do remember them linking their episode on what is Linux, which they made back in 2016, which looking back on it today is wildly outdated and kind of made Linux look hard to use and just not a practical option for a home user, which I strongly believe is not true. But anyway, ironically, this is the video that actually got me to consider Linux as an alternative to Windows. Now, at first, Linux just seemed to me like this unknown, uncharted space in the tech ecosystem until they mentioned Ubuntu as an example of a Linux distribution. This is when I finally realized that Ubuntu is actually a Linux distribution. And because I had some prior experience with Ubuntu, that I vaguely remember, but it was prior experience anyway, and I can clearly remember its desktop looking like Mac OS, I actually started to really look at Ubuntu as a real alternative to Windows. And what kind of sealed the deal for me was when I looked for how to make Ubuntu look even more like macOS, and when I stumbled across this video particularly detailing how to theme it to look like the dark mode on macOS Mojave, which was the latest macOS version at that time, and it actually replicated macOS pretty closely. Not just with the theme, but icons included, dock included, even the feel of macOS was mimicked pretty well, considering that Ubuntu is not really something that was meant to mimic macOS. And by the way, this is all spanning a 5-month period from August 2019 to January 2019. In January 2019 was when I finally decided to get a copy of Ubuntu, flash it to a flash drive, and install it on a dual boot with Windows. And at the time, Ubuntu 18.04.1 was the latest LTS release. And I will actually say I did not really have a good first experience with Ubuntu, because I don't know, I must have done something to break the installation, but after a couple days, it was no longer booting into the latest kernel that was installed. I had to use the kernel version prior to that, and it was no longer installing or removing software, and I couldn't even get my Mac tweaks installed, which was, kind of the thing that drew me to Ubuntu. So that kind of turned me off from Ubuntu for about a month, but it still left that desire to get off the Windows platform. And I wasn't quite ready to accept that Windows is my only option and just leave it at that. So I just decided to give it a second chance, and it's February 25th of 2019. I got a copy of Ubuntu again, this time 18.04.2 LTS, flashed it to a flash drive, installed it on a dual boot, and this time I actually did my due diligence to maintain a working installation, and it actually worked pretty well for me. And it didn't take me long for Ubuntu to go from being a secondary OS that used just as a hobby project to make it look like Mac OS and explore what I could do with it, to Ubuntu actually becoming a daily driver. It was, I think within about a week, I realized that this is actually now a daily driver. Now, at first, I just thought that Ubuntu was just going to be a temporary daily driver until I could finally afford to get my hands on a Mac. But throughout the course of my initial few months on Ubuntu, I realized that Mac is pretty much out the window for me. This is actually going to be a permanent daily driver. And looking back on that whole switch, I will admit I did have an advantage that most Windows users, when they're first coming over to Linux, don't have. Back then, my curiosity when it comes to computers was in full swing, and I was just growing sick and tired of the Windows platform. First, that started out as just getting bored of having the same old Windows look and feel all the time, but then it just escalated into even bigger reasons to stop using Windows. Privacy and security being the biggest among them. And that actually gave me kind of a desire deep down to get off the Windows platform. Most Windows users, when they're coming over to Linux, they kind of have this unconscious bias towards Windows, which causes them to complain that, oh, Linux can't do everything Windows can after literally like 5 minutes of using the OS. Well, in my case, that unconscious bias was already mostly eroded away, which would explain why I even thought of giving Ubuntu a second chance, and why that second good experience with Ubuntu had no problem just ripping that Windows bias completely out of me. But anyway, of course, I did not go straight from being a Windows user who knew almost nothing about Linux to the Linux user with 3 years of experience that uses Linux exclusively that I am now. For the first few months up until July 2019, I started off with a Ubuntu Windows Dual Boot until July 2019, when I realized that I really no longer needed Windows on my main system, and I just removed it. And July 2019 was also around the time when I started experimenting with virtual machines. And I can say without a doubt that mid-2019 was the time that my perspective on virtual machines completely shifted. Virtualization went from being a cool concept to me to being just a normal part of my everyday life. Like nowadays, I rely on virtualization to make a lot of my videos, so that way I don't have to do my Linux installation tutorials, for example, on my main computer, or even another spare computer that I have lying around. And that now leads me to what actually drove me to start this channel, where I mainly focus on Linux, specifically Ubuntu, trying to promote awareness of it, especially among Windows users. Well, I just felt that Linux was such a great alternative to Windows, and I wish that a lot more Windows users knew about it and were willing to give it a try. So that prompted me on October 27th of 2019 to finally start my channel. Now, on that very first day, I was mainly focused on just building the brand for my channel, like writing the description, uploading my profile picture, getting it verified with the phone number, etc. And then the next day, October 28th of 2019, is when I actually recorded and edited my first video. And then on October 29th of 2019, I finally finished editing it, made the thumbnail, and it was ready to upload. And it was a tutorial on how to install Ubuntu on a dual boot with Windows. So that's how I started off. And then I went on to how to remove Ubuntu from a dual boot with Windows on both legacy and UEFI BIOSes separately, since they were two different processes. And then I went on to make how to remove Windows from a dual boot with Ubuntu, which actually today is my most popular video to date in terms of views. And then it led into how to encrypt your home folder on Ubuntu, which led on to even more ideas, which I've converted into YouTube videos for my channel over the course of 2.5 years. And these videos total over 100 at this point. And if we fast forward to the pandemic in 2020 to 2021, I actually want to say that I used Ubuntu exclusively for my online school. I used Microsoft Teams for Linux and the LibreOffice productivity suite, the latter of which actually comes pre-installed on Ubuntu, and it actually worked really well for me. I remember getting comments on this channel saying that Linux can't work well for someone doing online classes. I just thought I'd throw that in here to kind of say, no, that statement is not accurate at all. Like, I guess it can hold some kernel of truth if someone's online classes required software that was not available on Linux, but that particular scenario didn't apply to me, or most people for that matter. So anyway, to conclude this video, am I glad I went on this Linux journey? Yes, absolutely. After all, if I didn't, I most probably wouldn't be sitting in front of this camera talking to all of you right now, and I probably would not have even been able to even dream of having a YouTube channel with hundreds upon hundreds of subscribers and counting. And over the course of my 3 years on Linux, I gained a vast amount of knowledge about computers, even getting into servers, which actually reminds me of something I forgot to mention. In May through July of 2021, can't believe that was a year ago already, I actually set up a home media server for my house out of a spare computer that was just lying around. Now, unfortunately, this project turned out to be a failure because really no one except me was using it. And if I'm going to be the only one using a file server, why not just have an external drive that doesn't need to be constantly powered on all the time? So that project ended up being a total failure. Also because there just wasn't really much to store on it. Like, my family doesn't really have media that we store locally. We mostly just stream stuff off of streaming services like Netflix. But I am glad I actually delved into that project, because that is actually what taught me a lot about servers and how the internet works. In fact, not only about how the internet works, it actually kind of showed me how I could apply that knowledge of how the internet works in the real world. And that's an example of computer knowledge that I would definitely not have gained had I not gone on this Linux journey. Now, you may be asking me, do you have any regrets about going on this Linux journey? Well, the only regret I have about it is not doing so sooner. I actually wish that the very first thing I did with my first computer after it was all set up was install Ubuntu on a dual boot with the Windows 8 installation. But anyway, thanks for watching. If you like this video, found it interesting, hit the like button, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Hopefully this video inspired you to start a Linux journey of your own, and I'll be more than happy to help.